And I find that is such an amazing social construct, right? Because we've collectively agreed that there are some goods, whether it's Swiss watch, I mean, from Patek Philippe, or a Rolex, or say drinking a certain kind of champagne, or driving a certain car, or a certain set of jewels from wherever the top jewelry stores are, or say, for instance, being a member to an exclusive club, or so many things, as you said, the private jet or the yacht. These are these displays or the symbols of wealth. And what I find, and this is something else I read a few months back, is there is this absolute splurge that people are indulging right now, where everything is running short. Like Rolex is not able to meet demand. I think LVMH is not able to produce enough high-end champagne, because everyone's just like, I'm not going to save anymore. I'm going to spend and I'm going to live it up. So here are two things where I want to ask you what's going on. One is when you do have the money, right? When you have a lot of money, excessive money, and you decide to buy an extra apartment or your extra house, or a house in the country, or decide to buy a helicopter because you want to go skiing for the weekend, whatever it may be. It's relative, right? I want to buy a watch, which I've been saving up for, but I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to save up. I'm just going to buy it. The other kind, I've come across a few of these examples, is when they don't have the money, but they have access to credit cards, or they have access to friends who have money. So to keep up this image, they get all these things. They get the fancy car. I mean, again, this fancy could be relative, right? For someone, it could be a Rolls Royce. For someone, it could be a Mercedes C-Class. For someone, it could be a Toyota. It depends. But I'm saying they get these symbols of wealth, relative wealth, on credit, and they don't have the money. So I remember an example of this where someone had a relatively well-paying job, and they had taken up all these things, a nice apartment in a good address, in a good condo. They had their kid going to a really good school. They had taken a loan on, everything was on loan. They'd taken a nice car. They'd got this membership. They'd got that membership. Bam, COVID, the lockdown hit. The guy lost his job. He had to lose everything because everything was he was in debt. So we have this one system where people spend excess money on these brands, on these symbols, but then you have the other people who spend just to keep up the appearance when they don't really actually have the wealth or the money.
Right. No, that's a huge problem, a problem which has always been with us, right? So, I mean, of course, from the point of view, a proper definition of who is rich or wealthy, you have to look at what is called net worth, right? So you have to look at the net value of assets, and if you're in debt, the debt is detracted from that, right? So these are people who are not actually wealthy, actually not very wealthy, who, because they get certain signals from other side of society, step up their consumption because they want to be like this kind of models they have. Yeah. Now, this problem had been with us for a very, very, very long time, right? So this is one of the reasons why in Europe, in the Middle Ages, cities established what they were called sumptuary laws, which actually were trying to contain consumption on the part of the very rich. So they were saying, okay, you can't have this kind of cloth if not in a given and specific moment, and you can't go and walk in the street with more than this number of jewels on you. And then the problem is, the problem is, okay, the reason for this is to avoid that other people become angry at showing how wealthy you are compared to them, and also to prevent them from becoming indebted because they will feel like they have to consume like you. And then what happens in practice, unfortunately, for in some respect, is that these laws weren't actually entirely forbidding this. They were forbidding to do it, but what they could do was to do it anyway, to wear whatever they wanted and have as many jewels they wanted and to throw very lavish party and then pay a fine. And those who could afford it consumed very visibly how much they wanted and then paid a fine, and that was okay for them because they could afford it, right? Now, this is the Middle Ages, but in a period much closer to our own, so the years preceding the beginning of the financial crisis of late 2007, which then triggered the Great Recession 2008, we know that, especially in the case of the United States, a problem was that many people in the middle class, actually, and even the upper middle class, were consuming more than they could. They were actually getting into debt. So they were, in that case, for example, also for buying the house, they were trying to buy a house which was nicer than they could have afforded because they were able to get loans and mortgages on a very cheap basis, right?
Yeah.
And then the society as a whole becomes very indebted, and when you have the kind of bubble bursting, they got into big troubles. Not only the poor, because we know that the problem there was also with people who were pretty poor and who were trying to buy the house and then they lost everything, but also the middling groups were experiencing this, right? And you mentioned the case of COVID, and again, in certain societies, that's the moment when this kind of issue becomes very visible. But the problem is always the same. People will desire what they see other consuming, and this is only human, if you want. That's a human sentiment. You can understand that. Maybe we could say, okay, it would be better to try and make your levels of consumption match your level of income, because that's a reasonable thing to do. But then we all, I think, can understand why one could be tempted, especially if the future looks bright. One could be tempted to try and anticipate a bit the expectations of future consumption. And then if the future actually reveals not to be as bright as one expected, then you can really run into trouble. But what's the solution to that? It's very difficult to say, and it might well be that there is no solution as long as the differences in the levels of income and wealth are so high and continue to grow, right? So the point is, this is one of the reasons, in fact, why too high economic inequality within a society might lead to problems. There are many other reasons, but this is one specific reason why, right? And then we have another point to make here. That's something which I studied specifically for Western societies, because then I was also looking in this book, which I mentioned, at how, for example, the Christian religion shaped these things from the Middle Ages on. So there was something which, to me, was kind of typical of Western societies, which is not to say that also others don't experience the same thing in a slightly different way. But the point is, if we look at the West, and I think it's not only the West actually, right? But I'm sure the West, so to say. Yeah. They are sometimes looked as heroes or superstars, which wasn't assigned to them in the past. I mean, if you look at the Middle Ages, from the point of view of medieval Christian theology, all the wealthy who were commoners, because nobles were not a problem, as they had their larger access to resources because of God's plan, basically. But if you're a commoner and you were wealthy in the Middle Ages, you were by definition a sinner, because what was your wealth for? Why were you accumulating wealth which you could have used to help the poor and do some good, right? So by definition, you were a sinner, and it was also a very serious sin or a deadly sin, as like the Christian theology would claim, right? Yeah. But if you compare the situation with the one today, it's clear that we are much more accepting of the presence in society of individuals who are super wealthy than I would say at any previous point in history, and we kind of are also more accepting of these people having an influence on culture, on society in general, on politics even, and this might also be kind of a problem.
That's an interesting thing, right? Because every time there's been historically, every time there's been a heavy concentration of wealth, and when people have no food, and at the same time they see a golden carriage crusted in diamonds driving past, the frustration and the resentment keeps building. And especially when you put it in the context of these people are sinners, instead of giving back to society, they're accumulating wealth. There's been a huge movement, right? Whether it's the French Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, where it's more power to the people. Why aren't we seeing something like that now?
Right. And that's a great question. And that's, of course, a very big problem. Mm-hmm. Now, the French Revolution, interestingly, was about equality, right? So freedom, equality, and fraternity or brotherhood was, were the keywords of the revolution. But that equality was first and foremost a political equality. So it was an equality of rights, right?
Okay.
It's only later that the problem becomes economic inequality. And from the 19th century, this becomes more and more clear. Now, of course, equality of rights and equality of access to political institutions and economic inequality are not entirely disconnected, because from the classical age, from the philosophers of the Greek period, like Aristotle, we know, and they were actually arguing that if you have a society, if you have a political system which is a relatively open one, like an early democracy or a republic, then if you have some individuals who are much, much richer than all others, you can't expect them to have the same access to institutions as all the others. Mm. And actually, Aristotle himself said, and I was taking this from my title, that these people would be as God is among men, right? Mm. Would be really overcoming all others. So the problem then becomes whether you can have in the context of something which is basically a democratic regime of some sort, if you can have in order to have real, effective political equality of rights, the point is whether you can have a very high level of economic inequality. And you could argue that the answer is no, right? You can't, because then somebody will have a too large power to influence the political system.
Yeah.
And taking again the case of the United States, this becomes very clear by the beginning of the 20th century. So after the 19th century, when you have the industrialization in the United States, when you have the Gilded Age, so certain families becoming extremely wealthy, and by the end of the 19th century, they basically belong to some sort of wealth aristocracy in the United States. And then, at that moment, there is a development of a very serious concern, both in the political left and in the political right of the time, about the fact that these very, very wealthy people who were already controlling the finance and economy of the country might have taken control also over the politics of the country. Right. So this is the debate about the so-called money trust, which supposedly was like controlling the American economy. And this is when they try and limitate the power of influence of these super rich individuals, including by fragmenting their society. So the anti-monopoly, antitrust laws introduced in the United States also serve this political objective. So avoiding that some very rich individual or a group of them will be able to control the American politics. Now, are we today in the same situation as at the beginning of the 21st century? Well, from the point of view of the American society being accepting of super rich individuals who become directly involved in politics, we are in a very different spot. I would say today that's much better accepted. Donald Trump himself is a super rich. I'm Italian, and there is an Italian politician who actually started this new trend in super rich people becoming prime minister in the case of Italy. That's Silvio Berlusconi, who won many times elections in Italy, beginning in 1994. And he was the first super rich individual in any Western country who actually ran for top public post, and he won the election. And I don't think, this is not a political argument. This is simply whether society would have accepted in an earlier